On the morning of November 23, 1942, a map was laid out at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia that would force the Wehrmacht commanders to confront a truth they had been trying in various ways to avoid. Soviet forces had linked their pincers north and south of Stalingrad. The line on the map was a clean cut through the German logistics network, a severed rail and road lifeline, a ring closing around roughly 290,000 Axis troops. The intelligence briefing was blunt. The Sixth Army's supply lines were gone. A pocket had formed that was too large and too complex to sustain through any route still under German control. The central question that morning was not simply whether the Germans were trapped. It was how quickly the High Command would recognize what that trap meant for command, logistics, and the broader Eastern Front. If you want the full operational breakdown of Stalingrad, subscribe. This is a detailed look at how and when senior German commanders realized the net had been drawn. The story begins months earlier with the strategic choices that created the vulnerability. In the summer of 1942, the German High Command launched Case Blue, a campaign designed to secure the Caucasus oil fields and to deliver a decisive blow to Soviet logistics and industry. Hitler, for political and symbolic reasons as well as for military ones, insisted on a simultaneous drive to seize Stalingrad. That insistence split operational priorities. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced into the Volga Bend and became fixed around the ruined city. To its north and south, the German lines formed a salient that extended deep into Soviet territory. Those flanks were thinly held. Responsibility fell largely to the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, ill-equipped and poorly manned compared to their German counterparts. The result was an operational geometry that invited envelopment. A powerful spearhead anchored on the Volga, with vulnerable flanks that could be struck where the Wehrmacht lacked local superiority. The Soviets learned from earlier defeats and by November 1942 organized a coordinated double envelopment. On November 1920, under the larger plan codenamed Operation Uranus, Soviet forces struck at the weakly held Romanian sectors north and south of Stalingrad. The attacks were not intended to take the city directly, but to encircle the forces fighting within it. The offensives were launched by fronts under commanders, including Nikolai Vatutin and Andrei Yeremenko, with strategic oversight and coordination directed by the Stavka and figures such as Georgy Zhukov. Soviet formations concentrated armor and infantry against specific weak points, achieved local superiority, and then drove quickly to the rear. By November 23rd, a link-up near Kalash-on-Don had closed the ring. The encirclement took shape as an operational pocket roughly 30 by 25 miles in size, a consolidated area that contained German units, elements of other Axis contingents, and the urban wreckage of Stalingrad itself. The November 23rd intelligence briefing at Hitler's headquarters summarized these grim facts. Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, presented the operational picture. The Sixth Army was no longer simply facing a difficult theater. It was isolated. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, representing the Armed Forces High Command, understood the strategic implications. For many professional officers, the logic was immediate and stark. An encircled army needs either a viable path out or sufficient, reliable resupply until a relief can reach it. What followed, however, was the collision between professional military assessment and political insistence. Hitler's response was categorical. Withdrawal from Stalingrad was forbidden. The city had acquired symbolic value that, to him, outweighed the cold calculus of maneuver warfare. Into that vacuum stepped Hermann Göring. In meetings with Hitler and the Wehrmacht leadership, Göring assured the Führer that the Luftwaffe could sustain Paulus's forces by air, offering figures that quickly became the most cited promise of the crisis, roughly 500 tons of supplies per day. That assurance, enthusiastic public, politically useful, substituted for the more uncomfortable military discretion of retreat or negotiated withdrawal. On paper, Göring's claim sounded plausible only if one accepted a chain of optimistic assumptions. Large numbers of serviceable transport aircraft concentrated on one theater, favorable weather, secured airfields within the pocket, and the ability to fly repeated daily sorties without prohibitive losses. Those assumptions collapsed when measured against operational reality. The Sixth Army's daily consumption, food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, has been estimated at roughly 700 tons per day as a practical requirement to maintain a modern field army committed in positional combat. Even if that figure is treated as an approximation, the gap between requirement and promise was stark. Luftwaffe transport capacity, already stretched thin by commitments across multiple fronts, could not deliver 500 tons per day under combat conditions. Snow, freezing temperatures, and poor visibility limited sorties. Soviet air defenses and fighter patrols contested the air routes. Airfields inside the pocket were damaged or too small to handle the intended throughput, while fuel, maintenance, and spare part shortages degraded sortie rates. Logbooks and transport commanders' reports from the period reflect a harsher arithmetic. The Luftwaffe's deliveries quickly fell far short of the promised level, dropping to roughly 100 tons per day or less in early December, an order of magnitude below what would have been necessary to sustain Paulus formations fully. These assessments were repeated by Luftwaffe transport officers and logistics staff. They were not marginal complaints but a consistent recorded appraisal of what air supply could not achieve. The promise of an airlift changed the decision-making calculus at the top. If the Sixth Army could be maintained from above, Hitler reasoned, there was no need to abandon Stalingrad or authorize a risky breakout. For Hitler, this calculation combined military stubbornness with political symbolism. For the generals, it created an ethical and professional dilemma. Obey a direct order to hold or contravene that order to save an army. The German officer corps had long been shaped by a culture of obedience to the Führer, increasingly intensified by wartime centralization of decision-making. That culture mattered as much as the map. From November 23rd onward, German High Command operated on two parallel tracks. On the one hand, there were staff assessments that recognized the severity of the encirclement and the difficulties of relief or resupply. Seitzler, Keitel and Jodl understood the macro picture and warned of the limits of an air bridge. On the other hand, Hitler's direct interventions, forbidding withdrawal, welcoming Göring's assurances, set the formal chain of command. That gap between military assessment and political decision would be decisive. The immediate operational options were straightforward in principle but brutal in practice. Paulus could attempt to break out to link with a relief force. Manstein could attempt to punch through Soviet lines to open a corridor. Or the army could remain in place and await resupply and relief. Each option depended on variables that were shrinking by the day. The operational maneuver space surrounding the pocket, the availability of mechanized forces for a relief thrust, the condition of roads and weather, and the integrity of air supply. Erich von Manstein emerged as the most prominent proponent of an active relief. Commanding Army Group Don, he conceived a relief plan, Operation Winter Storm, that would drive from the southwest with a mobile armored spearhead to reach the Sixth Army. In mid-December, Manstein's forces mounted a vigorous advance. By about December 16th, they had pushed to within roughly 30 miles, around 50 kilometers, of the encircled formations. That advance represented the closest physical approach of any German relief attempt, and, for a time, it created a moment of tactical possibility. If Paulus had attempted a breakout to the southwest, the gap between the pocket and Manstein's forces might have been narrowed sufficiently to allow a partial link-up. Paulus did not order a breakout. His chief of staff, General Major Arthur Schmidt, and other members of his command group counseled caution and adhered to Hitler's standing orders to hold. The reluctance to break out was not simply personal timidity. It reflected professional calculations under orders, concern over the feasibility of moving large formations across contested ground without assured rear area security, and the political consequences of direct disobedience. There was also the practical constraint of coordinating a breakout with a relief force that itself was under pressure and whose own supply and lines of communication were threatened. Manstein later argued, and many post-war analysts have echoed him, that if Paulus had attempted a breakout in late November or early December, significant portions of the Sixth Army might have escaped to join the relief force. That claim is contested and must be treated with care. It rests on assumptions about the feasibility of synchronized maneuvers under enemy fire, the state of German combat power in the salient and on the relief route, and the ability of the Luftwaffe to support such an operation with supplies and close air cover. Historians disagree about whether a breakout, had it been ordered and executed, would have succeeded in rescuing the bulk of the army. What is clear and not disputed is that by the time Manstein's spear reached its closest point in mid-December, the operational window for a large-scale breakout had narrowed dramatically. Complicating Manstein's effort was a wider Soviet response. On December 16th, the Red Army launched Operation Little Saturn, a follow-up designed to exploit the success of Uranus by attacking Axis armies on the lower Don and in the Caucasus periphery. Little Saturn struck at Italian and Hungarian formations and rolled up Axis positions, threatening the rear and flank of Manstein's relief corridor. Once Soviet offensives expanded in depth, the possibility of a stable German corridor between the relief force and the pocket diminished. Manstein found his supply line stretched thin, and his route exposed to counterattack. The combination of Manstein's limited operational strength, the deteriorating strategic context, and the intensifying Soviet pressure made a decisive breakthrough increasingly unlikely. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's supply effort, hailed at the outset as the solution, failed to deliver the necessary tonnage. The stark arithmetic is unavoidable. An operational army encircled and actively defending required vastly more material than the transport fleet could provide in the conditions they faced. Göring's public promise of 500 tons per day created expectations at the highest level of command and in the press, but transport logs and internal Luftwaffe assessments documented that sustained deliveries remained at best a fraction of that amount. By early December, the average tonnage reaching the 6th Army appears to have fallen to roughly 100 tons per day, sometimes less, depending on weather and the intensity of enemy action. That volume could not meet the 6th Army's basic needs for ammunition alone, let alone food, winter clothing, or medical supplies. Luftwaffe officers and quartermasters repeatedly reported that the airlift would be insufficient as the pocket's needs accumulated. These were not merely pessimistic predictions made after the fact. Contemporaneous transport reports and operational orders show repeated warnings about capacity and the dangers of relying on air supply as a strategy. The combination of stalled relief and inadequate air supply produced a hard progressive realization within the German High Command. Some officers and staff grasped the catastrophic implications almost immediately on November 23rd. The encirclement was operationally grave and required urgent adaptation. Others clung to the possibility of an air bridge or counted on relief efforts to reach the pocket. By mid-December, when Manstein stood at his closest point and Little Saturn began to widen the front, the opinion among professional soldiers hardened. The situation was now a containment, not a temporary gap that could be remedied by a single offensive. By early January, the evidence was unmistakable. The logistical tail was fraying, men in the pocket were suffering from cold and limited rations, and Soviet preparations for a final reduction of the pocket were in place. The Soviets did not simply sit and wait. On January 10, 1943, they launched Operation Ring, a methodical reduction designed to shrink the pocket sector by sector, drive in wedges, and destroy the encircled formations through pressure and isolation. Operation Ring combined artillery, rifle assaults, and systematic attrition against German positions. It was the operational culmination of the encirclement. Once Soviet forces committed to systematic reduction, the options for German command shrank to near zero. Paulus, still under orders to hold, faced a collapsing front and a dwindling stock of usable men and material. Within the German command, the formal acknowledgement of the trap's full implications arrived in stages. Seitzler and other staff officers who had warned earlier were now reinforced by the operational facts on the ground. Keitel and Jodel's assessments shifted from damage control to crisis management. Manstein's appeals for authorization to attempt more audacious relief efforts were constrained by lack of reserves and by Hitler's refusal to permit risky maneuvers that involved abandoning symbolic ground. The political overlay, Hitler's insistence on holding the city, continued to exert influence even as military necessity argued otherwise. The promotion of Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal late in January, on January 30, 1943, carried a grim subtext. In German military tradition, the bestowal of a Field Marshal's baton was almost never followed by capture. Hitler reportedly hoped that the title would encourage Paulus to choose suicide over surrender. For contemporary observers and for the men involved, the promotion looked like a final attempt to bind obedience through honor, even as the strategic position disintegrated. The final collapse began in earnest at the end of January. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. By February 2nd, organized resistance inside Stalingrad had ceased, and the remaining formations laid down their arms. The destruction of the 6th Army was complete or nearly complete. Approximately 290,000 Axis troops had been caught in the encirclement in late November. Many were killed in the subsequent fighting, while thousands more were eventually taken prisoner. The precise numbers vary among sources and remain the subject of detailed archival accounting. But the scale of the loss is unmistakable. What the High Command had discovered between late November and early February was not a single misstep, but a sequence of hard facts and choices. The initial discovery, the physical reality of the encirclement, occurred swiftly and was made explicit by the November 23rd briefing. The realization of its full implications, that the army could neither be reliably resupplied by air nor rescued by a relief force without paying prohibitive costs, and that the political insistence on holding Stalingrad made such costs likely, evolved through December and into January. Some commanders, particularly those steeped in operational staff work, saw the trap early. Others only accepted its scale after Manstein's relief proved insufficient, and Operation Ring began to grind the pocket down. The process of recognition was therefore progressive. Picture a series of commanders moving from alarm to reluctant acceptance as new facts arrived and options were methodically eliminated. Several structural factors explain why the recognition failed to produce earlier action. First, the decision to pursue dual strategic objectives in the summer of 1942, oil in the Caucasus and the symbolic seizure of Stalingrad, created the salience and mismatches the Soviets exploited. Second, the distribution of forces and the assignment of weak Axis allies to crucial flank sectors left gaps that Soviet operational planning exploited. Third, the Luftwaffe's optimistic assurances and the political capital invested in holding Stalingrad distorted the command calculus, delaying concession to withdrawal or breakout as legitimate military options. Fourth, the command culture that valorized obedience and centralized decision-making meant that subordinate commanders were often constrained by political directives. Finally, Soviet operational execution, improved coordination, concentration of forces and timing, turned those German vulnerabilities into a strategic disaster. Operationally, the failure to authorize or attempt a breakout in late November or early December remains a central counterfactual in debates over Stalingrad. Manstein and others later maintained that a coordinated breakout linked to a relief thrust might have salvaged a significant portion of the Sixth Army. That remains contested among historians because of uncertainties about timing, the strength and disposition of Soviet defenders, the condition of German units, and the Luftwaffe's ability to support such maneuvers. What is not disputed is that the window for such an operation closed rapidly as Manstein stalled, Soviet offensives widened, and logistical reserves dwindled. The destruction of the Sixth Army had consequences that echoed far beyond the Volga. Militarily, it shattered the Wehrmacht's offensive capacity on the Eastern Front and marked a turning point at which the strategic initiative gradually moved to the Soviets. Politically and culturally, it exposed the perils of a command system increasingly subordinated to ideological priorities and personal assurance, rather than to dispassionate operational analysis. Göring's promise, Hitler's refusal to countenance withdrawal, and the resulting reliance on an inadequate airlift became emblematic of a larger pattern. Political expedience and symbolic objectives shaping and ultimately undermining military decisions. Finally, there is a human and institutional lesson about the nature of discovery in wartime. The High Command did discover the trap at Stalingrad. The map and the briefing made the physical entrapment unambiguous on November 23rd. But discovery is not the same as actionable consensus. Recognition requires not only accurate intelligence and professional insight, but also the political will to act on that insight within the narrow windows that operational reality provides. At Stalingrad, the window closed as relief attempts stalled, supply options failed, and political choices foreclosed maneuvers. The High Command moved from awareness to resignation over weeks, not in a single definitive moment. The trap was uncovered on a map and then tightened by a sequence of decisions and failures. The strategic consequences were immediate and long-term. The Wehrmacht lost an entire field army at a critical point in the campaign season. Soviet forces, having demonstrated the ability to plan and execute large-scale operational envelopment, gained confidence and momentum. German morale and the aura of invincibility suffered a decisive blow, and the Eastern Front entered a new phase in which German forces were increasingly reactive. The Stalingrad episode also left an institutional residue. It forced post-war analyses of command culture, logistics, and the perils of conflating political symbolism with sound military practice. In summary, the physical encirclement was discovered and documented on November 23, 1942. That discovery prompted immediate alarm among army staff officers and some high command figures, but political assurances and Hitler's orders prevented immediate retreat or breakout. By mid-December, when Manstein's relief had reached its nearest point and the Soviets mounted Operation Little Saturn, the operational options had narrowed significantly. Operation Ring, launched January 10th, turned attrition into final collapse, and by January 31st, February 2nd, the Sixth Army had surrendered. The German High Command's recognition of the trap was thus a process, beginning with a map and a briefing and culminating in the grim acceptance of loss, shaped as much by logistics and battlefield reality as by the political choices that determined what could or could not be attempted. If you want to continue the story, watch our deep dive on Operation Uranus and the Soviet operational innovations that made the encirclement possible, or our profile on Erich von Manstein's relief efforts and the tactical choices that defined Winter Storm.